Trails of Cold Steel is one of the most recent entries in the Legend of Heroes series from Nihon Falcom. Released for the PS3 and Vita in the West during 2015, its sequel found a Western release on... actually, if this gets released when it's supposed to be, then today. Otherwise, in like a day or two before, well... I suppose it would be good for me to disclose my experience with the series before. I played Trails in the Sky, well, sort of. I got partially through years back before real life came up, and from there I found myself in that classic hole of trying to get back into an intensive RPG and essentially failing. I did like the game, despite really not remembering much now. My most distinct memories from it involve the brother and sister's relationship, me liking the battle system, an escalator, and the fact that the main battle theme somehow made it into my iTunes. I'm not really sure why I did that, but I'm not complaining. I like it. I recently finished my highly edited, though still quite lengthy Let's Play of Trails of Cold Steel, and I'm very excited for the sequel. And looking at the script, it might be a particularly long review, so let's just get started. Trails of Cold Steel would be defined as a position and turn-based JRPG with life simulation elements. Yes, that was sort of a mouthful, but there's a good reason for it. The game's battle system is quite complicated and builds off previous Legend of Heroes games for this most modern take on the system. When I say turn-based, it means that it takes on the variable order approach. Party members do not attack in a specific order, but instead are set on a metaphorical timer. Each person has a delay that is determined by their speed and most recent move used. Each time an action is taken, a new delay is calculated and the order is updated. And when I say position-based, I mean that it uses a pseudo-grid-based battlefield. A well-known example of purely grid-based systems would be the Fire Emblem series. Trails of Cold Steel drops the grid itself to open up the battlefield entirely to that movement. Moving is a perfectly viable use of a turn, and this position is important. Area of effect attacks can fall under different styles of an affected area, and the position of the attacker and the attacked changes strategy considerably. This combination of position and variable turn order is the start to that complicated battle system, as a large array of decisions are already in place before an attack is even decided. Once the attack is actually put into play, a whole new set of considerations related to players' feat. Skills, magic, buffs, and more are all present as they are in most JRPGs. Outside of the standard attacks, the different skills and magic are categorized as either crafts or arts. Arts are basically your magic. They require a delay between actually selecting them and casting them, but they are customizable and employ most of the standard strategies you see in JRPGs. They use MP, which is akin to your typical MP in JRPGs. Crafts are the yin to the art's yang, though. Bar a few exceptions, they require no delayed start, are unique to each character, and employ effects designed outside of the standard fare. Crafts also use a different resource called CP, and CP is acquired across battle instead of being depleted from the storage. The CP is also used for ultimate attacks, called S-Crafts. These are essentially desperation attacks that are usable at 100 CP and strengthened at 200. Draining your CP to 0, you can summon up an S-Craft at any time regardless of turn order to throw the battle into exciting animations unique to each character. So, now, basically you have to consider the wide variety of attack moves between the two, all while managing 2 different attack-based resource points. But that's not all. Now you have to consider the actual application of attacks themselves. Every character or enemy on the field has their own set of resistances. These include elements, statuses, and balancing. Elements are mostly exclusive to magic attacks, and viable damage for the attacks largely determined on how resistant they are. These can vary a ton, so it's very important to be aware of how resistant they are. Statuses are, well, like most JRPGs, but not much higher than you typically see. They include buffs, debuffs, additional damage conditions, delays to turn orders, and a lot more. Statuses are a large part of the game's mechanics, and I even found myself putting together entire strategies around them. Now, balancing is based on the concept of weapon type resistance. Each character's battle style has some combination between the 4 different weapon types, and the quality of their type proficiency and the enemy's resistance will determine if they become unbalanced after a standard attack or craft attack. What is unbalancing, though? Well, essentially, it throws off the enemy's ability to react and allows a quick follow-up chip damage attack. This follow-up gets powered up across the game's story too as you unlock more and more options for it. And this ties into another mechanic I already mentioned, the life sim elements. As a student in a military academy, your party will typically be made up of your fellow classmates. Across the time that the game takes place in, you form bonds with those friends. It's no Persona level day-to-day bonding, but the occasional day off will provide you with the option to seek out your friends to get closer. As you grow closer, your link level increases. As your link level increases, you unlock new offensive and defensive link abilities. In actual battle, you can link with another party member. Based on what abilities you've unlocked through leveling up the links, certain reactionary abilities like a quick heal, blocking an attack, or a counter-strike may happen. Linking is also what enables the follow-up attacks in the balance mechanic. The game contextualizes this as being able to predict each other's actions, and using the unbalanced enemy as an opportunity to apply some quick chip damage. While the bonding aspect of the game is not necessary to be effective in battle, it does offer a good advantage that can make or break a close battle. Plus, all the characters are pretty dapper anyway, so I don't know why you wouldn't want to do it. Overall, the battle system is quite intricate, and a lot of the things I touched on here are just the very skin-deep level of how these mechanics work. Though, realistically, any player will have plenty of time to learn it. It's not a short game. It also provides an opportunity to let each character's personality show a bit more through their unique crafts, weapon proficiency, and the integration of the life sim elements. This is not to say that there isn't any character customization. Outside of the depressingly low costume count for aesthetics, the characters can also be fine-tuned in their battle style. This comes into play in the typical JRPG fashion: equipables. You have your normal armor, weapons, accessory options, but you are also given your very own Arcus Orbment. Without really going into the lore itself, an orbment basically is a battle stimulant accessory that transfers focus energy into the character to use different abilities. Each can hold a number of quartz, and these quartz determine what magic you can use, ability enhancers, chances to implement statuses, and a whole bunch more different effects. Characters do have a whole lot of traits that hold them true to their personality. They do have a base set of stats, their orbment has a set structure, and they have a unique set of crafts. But when you start messing around with quartz combinations, they can fulfill many different roles in battle. Between offering a baseline for each character and the ability to fine-tune their battle roles, the game finds a nice balance in making sure no party member feels useless or bland. With all these layers to the battle system, it could be easy to get confused. Hell, it might even confuse the developers. Balancing a million different mechanics is never an easy task. When playing on normal, the game poses a greater challenge early on, and as you evolve and unlock more strategies along with a greater mastery of the system, basically, bosses tended to get easier for me. It can feel good to break the difficulty in any game when you first start to do it, but that can only really last so long. There are still some challenges scattered about later on, but those who watch my Let's Play can attest that I really started desiring the challenge again when I was absorbed into the mechanics of the game. In a sense, it's actually a good and bad thing. To recall, it means the system did its job. It got better and better the more I got invested. Essentially, the battle system is a decent mirror of the game as a whole, too. It's very complicated, even excessively so at times, but it's fun, strategic, quite exhilarating for a turn-based game. It lets the story slowly introduce you to it as it piles layers onto layers, and by the end, it really feels like the commitment you give is truly worth it. Okay, to start, I really have to say this. This is a long game. While there are factors to doing a Let's Play that does extend the length of a game a little, it still managed to be about 80 hours for me. The story tends to get bigger and grander as you play, so make sure you know what you're getting into before stepping in. You start by looking into a desperate moment from later in the story, and after that the game flashes back to Reem Swarzer, our main character arriving at Thor's military academy. A 2-year sort of high school level academy in a world still largely based around Sunday school education. It brings together commoners and aristocrats from across the country called Erebonia. While this class system between commoners and nobles is usually kept segregated in the different classes in the school, Reem finds himself with the opportunity to join a new 6th class that is experimenting with a mixture of the two classes, called Class 7. The class is also experimenting with a new technology called Arcus Ornaments that allow a slight, almost telepathic connection between compatible soldiers that can harmonize their battle tendencies. From there on, Reem finds himself at the center of Class 7 and their struggles spanning from class tensions to terrorism. Now this might sound like it's a lot to take in all at once at the beginning of the game, and it is. Each detail is actually explored extensively in some of the most expansive world building you can find in JRPGs. The game takes place in the Erebonian Empire, a country with clear German-styled inspirations and a heavy tension from the political factions from the previous mentioned class system. There are still other countries that surround Erebonia, like the Calvert Republic, the Barrel, and many others. In fact, these other countries actually find themselves at the settings of other games in the Trails subseries, like the Trails of the Sky games that I mentioned in the intro. Erebonia itself is a powerhouse military presence, but the split between the federal governance and the regional territories controlled by nobles leaves little room for negotiation between the two hard-headed factions. I would say that this world building is extremely character-driven. People react to the world and the world reacts back. This applies across the board to politics, the supernatural, technology, war, and more. This would definitely be my favorite type of world building, as it intrinsically captures how the real world really works. People drive history. Events out of our control happen, but what comes next and before are driven by human will. It really does make the world in Trails of Cold Steel feel alive itself, and it speaks to how well-written characters and their motivations can be here. Mind you, the game does like to dangle these motivations and mysteries related to all that in your face, though. You start out as a typical military academy student and slowly get involved with events much larger than most would ever really imagine. It is a slow burn. By making storytelling based on reactions to reactions, it means the story is built up in layers. Slowly but surely, the conflict does become prominent, but there is a reliance on character building and foreshadowing early on. If you can embrace the character building, you'll be fine with the slow, enjoyable burn. But I would also say that I think the slow burn is easily made up for by the upside to the style of world building. Sure, it could still use some fine-tuning to the pacing, but this plot does achieve what little others do. By building story of natural reactions between the world and characters to create that chain reaction of plot, the story can tackle world building and characterization without giving up the other's quality. Some stories like to fall into having the world to be a plot unto itself, and let the characters become pawns without any real influence or real growth. Some stories easily fall into ignoring the world entirely, simply create a character story. Not either of those are bad, but Trails manages to grab the best of both worlds. That is one of the things I really like about it. One of the things you'll notice in Trails of Cold Steel is something that seems to be its bread and butter. Long, panning, establishing shots. Seriously. Being completely serious, it is sort of a trivial complaint, but it sort of speaks a little bit towards the stated presentation. It strikes as sort of an odd middle ground between budget storytelling and the more cinematic approach. And it really does tend to show across the board. The art style is nothing to get excited about. The art isn't bad, and the transition to 3D is decent, and the designs are typically okay or better, but it's all very mainstream. The art shines best when it's paired with everything else in motion. Typically, the presentation is chopped up into traveling, cutscenes, and battles. By traveling, I mean the typical dungeon crawling or overworld exploration. Here you can see the UI demonstrating its effective functionality and occasional good, just original ideas. The biggest problem in the overworld are probably the loading times. I played the Vita version, so this was more pronounced, but the more dense overworlds, especially towards the end of the game, had a tendency to spend up to a maximum of, say, about a dozen seconds loading. This was rare, and less than a handful of areas actually created notable problems, but it could be significant and was very noticeable at the time. Cinematics also had some occasional performance problems too, with the very top end of performance needs hitting frame rate expectations and lowering that. Again, these performance and loading time issues only ever became notable on a few rare occasions, but it was present enough that I really need to make note of it. Speaking of cinematics, typically cutscenes comprise of characters and text bubbles. It actually works very well over the traditional text box cinematics you see in JRPGs, and allows them to cut corners effectively, and is really just flexible enough to span from the static conversations to the most action-heavy scenes. In a way, this does tell how the story of the cinematics typically play out. There are a lot of little details placed into most every scene, from dialogue to camera to everything else. There are a lot of little oversights that often show technical budget and limitations too. Realistically, they do manage to typically treat the important details with the concern they deserve. Battles are a bit more consistent though. The interface is quite intuitive despite the complexity of the battle system, and the animations between arts, crafts, and S-crafts really do just add a sense of excitement to every single battle. The music helps with this last point a lot by playing on high energy melodies. I would even say the music is one of the standout parts of the game. Battle music tries its best to get in the center of the stage and announce itself to the world. It really does play to the tone of the battles excellently. Field music used in the overworld and many of the cutscenes uses a bit of a different approach. It manages to strike that balance between atmosphere, settings, and melodies that you rarely see. Many games tend to focus too heavily on having strong melodies that the music really can't get out of the way of the events actually going on in the game. and others are so obsessed with setting atmosphere that the soundtrack itself is just underwhelming. And while I'm still on the topic of sound, I'd like to comment on the voice acting. It's very good actually, with some standouts like Green and Sarah. There's no Japanese sub option or anything, but the English dub quality is high enough that no one but the most pure of purists have a reason to complain. My only complaint is that there really isn't more, but it's hard to expect in a game so long to have everything voiced. One of the nicest parts about Trails of Cold Steel is the pure attention to detail. The world really feels alive and the story feels natural from characters to event progression. It cuts some corners in cinematic, sure, but typically it does step it up when it's important to keep the immersion alive. Little things like having NPCs with real lives progressing like they're living their own actual life across the course of the game makes it abundantly clear how much attention they put to this. Generally, the cinematics are a good step up from the typical JRPG, and attention to detail does well at keeping the interest curve there, even though there are slower parts of the game, and, well, there are definitely slower parts of the game. One of the greatest complaints about the game is its pacing. It plays setup for a long time, and it piles layers onto layers in the story, and it relies heavily on character building for the earlier story section. You also have a sort of redundant plot structure that repeats itself each chapter. It's not inherently bad, but it can certainly become very, very evident earlier on, especially when the game's cards are still mostly hidden. Chapters are actually largely split up into sections of 4. The first is the story set up on the school campus. The second is some dungeon crawling on the school campus. The third is story set up on a field study mission at different locales across the Empire. And the last is the final dungeon at that locale. The first and third sections are typically comprised of several side quests that can be optional or some of them mandatory. They range a lot in how interesting they are. Your performance in all quests, main story and side story, results in a final grade for your adventure each chapter section. These aren't required for any progression, but you can get some nice goodies as you continue. But in general, I'd say the story structure really never got boring to me, despite the game getting to around 80 hours as I finished. Not that not boring is a great thing to aspire to, but even the slower sections do well to keep both my attention, let me slowly get invested in the battle system. Oh, and before I end this section, I really have to talk about the ending. In a very vague way, yes, but I will be talking about the ending right in a second. So, very vague spoilers and almost metaphorical spoilers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Last chance to jump to the next section. I'll even throw an annotation here. Okay, so imagine a friend raving over a good game. They talk about how good it is and always show you quick gifs of some awesome action moments they had. They speak of it in general terms and how crazy the animations are and how smooth the movement is, with only bits and pieces for you to put together. But ultimately, it is enough to get you very excited. You finally get the game, and apparently it's an action RPG. So everything your friend said, but it's just different. It's still good, but it's different. The fact of the matter is that it's different. It defies some of the base expectations built up for it, and now it really needs to prove that it's worth that hype. Basically, that's how I feel about the ending, in a very vague, metaphorical way. Those who have played it and finished it probably know what I mean, especially as someone who doesn't really know anything else about the series. And this, in all practical senses, is my first game in the series. So, there you have it. Trails of Cold Steel exemplifies the best of the best within the JRPG genre. With a mature story, addictive music, an expansive world, highly strategic combat, and wonderful writing from front to back, Trails of Cold Steel feels like a classic novel come to life. It's certainly not perfect. The pacing slogs down as a severe focus is given to the character's journey over proper pacing of the mysteries, and its technical feats would have been impressive about 15 years ago, even if you ignore the long loading times. Trails of Cold Steel does something special. It stays with you. By placing that emphasis on the journey, those with the dedication will experience that journey along with the characters from the darkest depths of their despair to the highest levels they soar. It's a large world, and the writing takes full advantage of that world building on display. Few JRPGs manage this, few games manage this, few stories manage this. As you see these characters grow, and as the game feeds you more of the humor, intrigue, and drama, you find yourself growing as well. Whether this is the combat or by connecting to the cast, the game is definitely sure to pay you back your dedication several times over. At the same time, this expansiveness of concept may be a drawback. In that same novel comparison, it may be more akin to an excellent 1,000-page epic. Such a commitment is not easily undertook, and this game finds itself on the extreme end of that required dedication. As much as I wish I could give the game my must-try rating, I cannot. It is very, very far from being a good entry JRPG, and my must-try rating is reserved for games I think anyone could pick up and have a good chance of enjoying to the extent I did. Combine that with the fact that it's not a standalone story, and it becomes much harder to think that just anyone should be expected to put in that much dedication. Instead, I will say Trails of Cold Steel stands at the top of the genre as a shining example for others to follow. It may slip up at times, but the goals and execution on many aspects are well deserving of the attention from any fans of the genre and developers looking for inspiration. Okay, recommendations. I'm gonna make this quick because this is a very long video already, I can feel it. Persona 4, character building, JRPG, long, doesn't require it's a better entry long JRPG out there. You also have Fire Emblem, where it also has some of that social aspects just like Persona does, and also has more group-based combat. I mentioned these both in the review, so I figured they'd be good to mention here because they do have some of the same appeals. Okay, after that, I really do hope that this comes up on the date I want it to, which is the release date for the second game. And I really hope I get that on Tuesday. It's being delivered by, I get stuff from Best Buy Gamer Club stuff, and looking at my tracking for that, it's not totally sure it'll get here before the 6th, and normally I will post videos the day after, so let's just hope it gets here on time. I am really hoping it does, because I have a sort of momentum plan for the beginning of next week, and I'm really hoping I'm able to do it. If not, then not. Just a quick heads up that might be an issue. See you all, Trails of Cold Steel 2 review when I do that at the end of that Let's Play, or in the series, which will be starting in the next day or two. Drive safely, everyone.